Hello, everyone. I am so happy and pleased to introduce Sam Sokol. He is here from the Times of Israel. He is the Times of Israel's political correspondent. He was previously a reporter from the Jerusalem Post, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and Haaretz. He is the author of Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews, and the winner of the 2015 B'nai B'rith Word Center Award for Excellence in Diaspora Reportage. His reporting has appeared in Tablet, The Forward, The Kiev Post, Open Democracy, Foreign Policy, and the Columbia Journalism Review, among other politicians. He's a native New Yorker. He moved to Israel in 2005, where he served 2 years in the IDF before entering journalism. He lives with his wife and children in the Jerusalem suburb of Beit Shemesh. And so without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome you, Sam. Thank you for being here, and I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Lily. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. It's also very nice change of pace to do a Zoom where it's not 2 in the morning my time. So thank you for that. I'm going to speak to you today about the political situation in Israel over the course of the past year, past couple of years since October 7th. Things have been obviously very dramatic and very busy, on the war front in terms of what's happening in Gaza now with reports of food shortages, with discussions now in Israel about potentially occupying the Strip and building new settlements. But behind all of that other drama, which, you can all read about in any American paper, there's a lot of internal drama within Israel itself that I don't think gets as much attention, in the US, and which is equally important to if you want to understand what's happening here. They say all politics is local, and there's a lot of local dynamics that affect, how Israel operates, both in Gaza and elsewhere. And one of the things I really want to start with sort of is stepping back a minute, you know, to before the Gaza war. And, in the year prior to October 7th, Israel was obviously riven by, deep political cleavages over the government's plan to overhaul the judiciary. I believe I discussed this last year when I spoke to your synagogue, so I'm not going to belabor it, but Israel was basically split on on the Netanyahu government's plan to weaken the powers of the Israeli judiciary, the High Court's power of judicial review, to give the coalition almost untrammeled control over the Judicial Selection Committee, and to give the Knesset the ability to override decisions by the court striking down legislation. This is something that many Israelis across the board, on the left and center certainly, but also even on the right, even among Likud voters, really thought was something dangerous for Israeli democracy. People thought we'd be going down, the road of countries like Hungary or Poland or Turkey, this so-called illiberal democracies. And a lot of Israel's sort of political drama was put aside after October 7th. And for the first few months after October 7th, a lot of this type of stuff was basically frozen, was put on the side and saying, we're going to have national unity for now. But after the first few months post October 7th, partisan politics in Israel returned with a vengeance. Fights over the judiciary, fights over ongoing efforts to fire the attorney general, which I will get back to later because that's something that's happening now, uh, as well as fights over government legislation to control the media and to basically defund various public media outlets, which, while government funded, were independent and often uh, reported stories critical of Netanyahu and his coalition. Uh, but one of the issues which sort of rises above everything else and is what's one of the most divisive issues in Israel today has been the issue of the ultra-Orthodox, the so-called Haredim. I've never particularly liked the phrase ultra-Orthodox. It implies that they're more traditional in terms of their Judaism than other denominations. Like we're the only legitimate, expression of Judaism, but that's the common nomenclature, so we'll go with that. Now, since the 40s, there's been sort of a status quo in place, which was that the ultra-Orthodox were exempt from military service. David Ben-Gurion in the 40s came to an agreement with the Haredi political party, Agudat Yisrael, that 400 yeshiva bachurim, 400 Talmud students, would be exempt from the military. Now, at the time, Ben-Gurion basically thought, the Haredi community was decimated by the war. They want to recreate their, yeshivas. It's an existential issue for them, and they're demographically going to disappear anyway. It's not a big deal. They don't matter. So I need their political support, so let's give it to them. Well, the Haredim didn't disappear. They kept growing and growing and growing. And when Menachem Begin and the Likud took over in the 1970s, you know, that led to a massive increase in uh, attendance in yeshivas and participation in kollels, which are yeshivas for married men. Ultra-Orthodox workplace participation plummeted. It's now for ultra-Orthodox males, something around like 50-something%. Ultra-Orthodox women work at around the same rate as secular women, except that they usually have less education and don't work jobs that are, as remunerative, that offers much remuneration. But generally speaking, the Haredim work less and they don't serve in the army. Has been an arrangement called Torato Umanuto. Torah is his profession. Basically, the idea is if you learn full-time in yeshiva, you are eligible for annual service deferrals until you hit the age of 26, at which point you are totally exempt from the military. Now, this had the dual impact of one, keeping the Haredim out of the military, meaning that in every single war, the people who bore the burden and died were, generally speaking, secular, traditional, and religious nationalist, religious Zionist, but not ultra-Orthodox. And at the same time, because you had to learn full-time in yeshiva to get your deferrals, you couldn't work, and it helped keep Haredim out of the workplace. Now, for the past few decades, the courts have repeatedly said that this is illegal, that it violates equality, but the courts have continued to give the government the ability to sort of punt on this. They would say, this is wrong, this is illegal, we're going to give you 5 years or however long to legislate a solution. And this basically allowed them to kick the can down the field for decades. Now, after October 7th, Israel needed a massive increase in manpower. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of additional soldiers. Now, I finished reserve duty before October 7th, and in any case, I was not a combat soldier, so they didn't call me back. They didn't want me, but a lot of my friends, relatives, coworkers were doing stint after stint, fighting in Gaza and Lebanon, going to the West Bank to free up regular service troops for fighting in Gaza. Closest I got to combat was when I embedded with the IDF in Lebanon and a Hezbollah drone exploded about 100 yards from me. But for the most part, I wasn't involved. But, if you are a non-Haredi Israeli Jew, you are either in the army or know someone who is. You know, you have couples where the wife or the husband will be doing hundreds of days of reserve duty. It has broken up marriages, forced people to stop university studies, destroyed businesses. It's taken a very hard social and economic toll. And this has generated incredible resentment against the Haredim, who, on their part, say two things. One, they say that the army will secularize them, and they can't do that. And they also say that going to the army basically is not a good idea because they believe their Torah learning protects, that we get spiritual protection from Torah learning, which is more important than soldiers actually going out into the field. Obviously, these are the things that everybody else in Israel rejects. I personally served in an ultra-Orthodox unit during my mandatory service. I was in the headquarters company as a cook of the Nachal Haredi battalion, which is an ultra-Orthodox battalion. And I can categorically say that it created an incredibly good environment. And someone who went in ultra-Orthodox would leave ultra-Orthodox. But the basic Haredi argument is we cannot go to the army. Uh, in fact, one thing you keep hearing over and over in Haredi propaganda and in stickers on walls and posters is basically, we would die rather than enlist. Uh, so the rest of Israeli society is enraged by the Haredim. We're paying the price and they're not, is the basic idea here that people are saying. And the Haredim aren't going. There are exceptions. I know a chassid in my neighborhood who just lost his son fighting in the war. I have a Haredi cousin who sent, I can't remember, either 3 or 4 of his children to fight. But generally speaking, they're not contributing to the war effort. So last June, the several organizations, including the Movement for Quality Government in Israel, went to the High Court with a petition, basically said, this is unsustainable. We need a ruling. We need a ruling now. You have to force the Haredim into the army. Now, the court, in an unprecedented ruling, said not only are these ongoing exemptions illegal, totally illegal, the court said that any yeshiva which receives funding from the government, and they receive it based on a point system, based on how many people study in the yeshiva, can no longer receive money for yeshiva students who are not going to the army, and they ordered the government to begin drafting the Haredim. Now you have to understand how many Haredim there are and that aren't going to the army. The army currently says it has a manpower shortage of about 12,000 troops, 7,000 of whom need to be combat soldiers. There are currently 80,000 Haredim of draft age who are not serving in the military. And over the past year, the government has sent out about 70 something, I think about 78,000 enlistment orders to Haredim, 54,000 of those in the last month. Out of that number, I think something around like 1,500, 1,700. I remember the numbers at the tip of my, at my fingertips here. I'd have to look it up, but around that amount actually responded and showed up. Overall, there's a small number of Haredim that go every year. About 2,700 Haredim went into the army over the last year. So a really, really big problem. So Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition has basically been dependent for years on Haredi participation. In order to get a parliamentary majority and have a coalition, Netanyahu has relied on the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Torah Judaism parties, UTJ. And after the court's ruling, these parties doubled down on their demand from Netanyahu to pass legislation which would re-enshrine their exemption from the military. And what Netanyahu did is pulled an old bill out of the files, a bill that hadn't been passed, dusts it off and says, we're going to modify this bill and use it to regulate ultra-Orthodox enlistment. Now, the Haredim were pushing for a bill that would basically have no teeth, which would say, okay, we're going to draft them, and here's how we'll draft them, but it wouldn't have any sanctions or penalties, and it would have very low quotas that would increase very slowly over time. They were looking for a way to buy time to maintain the status quo. Now, what we started to see is senior officials in Netanyahu's government and in the military saying basically this is unacceptable. So Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, basically said we have to bring the Haredim in. Netanyahu fired them both, and later was recorded bragging to a senior Haredi rabbi on a phone call, saying that he fired both of them because they were standing in the way of passing a bill to exempt Haredim from the military. But even after Halevi and Galant were gone, there was one barrier remaining to passing this type of legislation, and that was Yuli Edelstein. Edelstein is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, and a member of Netanyahu's Likud party and a former resident of the Soviet Union. He had, as a resident of the Soviet Union, been a refusenik, a dissident, who spent time in prison for trying to, engage in creating a Jewish cultural and religious life in the Soviet Union. This is a man who refused to give in to the communists, and he refused to give in to the Haredim. And as chairman of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, Vadat Chutz U'Bitachon, which was tasked with, drafting this legislation and passing it through, the various stages, he basically said, I will not allow this to pass unless it contains harsh sanctions on draft dodgers, large annual quotas, which build up over time until we have the Haredim in the army. And he basically put a stop to the entire legislative process for a year, and leading to, incredible Haredi anger against him. He was seen as enemy number one. Haredi newspapers and politicians painted him as this anti-religious communist, worse than the Soviets, who wanted to oppress the poor yeshiva students and put them in jail just for the crime of learning Torah. And which is very ironic because Edelstein literally spent time in jail for the crime of learning Torah and is an Orthodox lawmaker. But, in politics, you never let facts get in the way of a good story, especially when it promotes your viewpoint. Now, things were sort of stuck for a long time. The army kept sending out enlistment orders, but it didn't have the bandwidth to enforce them. The Haredim were ignoring them. Edelstein was, playing a rearguard holding action in the Vadat Chutz U'Bitachon, in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset. And, there was nothing that really could be done. The problem is that even in the best of circumstances, when we're not at war, Israel doesn't have the manpower or the facilities to arrest and jail tens of thousands of draft dodgers. There's no real solution by force to Haredi noncompliance. As opposition leader Yair Lapid put it, you can't send tanks into Bnei Brak being a central Israeli city, which is primarily Haredi. The general consensus among officials in the army, in the finance ministry, in the attorney general's office was that the only way to get them in was harsh sanctions. Basically, if a yeshiva doesn't send a certain quota of students, its funding gets cut off. If a yeshiva student doesn't go to the army after multiple summonses, you arrest him, and then you cut off his government benefits, childcare subsidies, discounts on municipal tax, transport subsidies that they get. The Haredim live very frugal lives because they're in yeshiva and they don't work. And even though the total benefits they get in aggregate add up to a lot, on an individual level, they don't add up to all that much money by the standards of you or me. But this small amount of money is critical to keeping them, in food and rent. So this idea, basically, we are going to destroy you financially unless you join, was seen by most experts as the only way to actually get them to enlist. They are very sensitive to financial pressures. But this was not done. The Attorney General said repeatedly that there are steps that could be taken to cut benefits by the defense minister and by various ministries without legislation, but these haven't been taken. And the actual legislation was stuck in committee because, you know, Edelstein was trying to prevent a bad bill from going forward while coming up with his own bill. And so this June, ahead of Israel's attack on the Iranian nuclear program, the Haredi parties started to get sick of what was happening. And they basically told Netanyahu, we are going to quit your coalition, bring you down to a minority government. And in fact, we are going to vote to dissolve the Knesset and bring down your government totally unless you pass this bill and you pass it now. So Edelstein goes to the Haredim and he presents his bill. And this is a bill that contains, again, harsh sanctions. And the Haredim go, well, this is unacceptable. You know, we're going to pull out. Now, you have to understand, ahead of Iran's attack, our attack in Iran, most Israelis, most politicians, most people here generally had no idea what was going to happen. It was kept very close to tightly to the chest. But who did know? Moshe Gafni, the chairman of one of the two factions in United Torah Judaism, had been informed by Netanyahu, and Aryeh Deri, the chairman of Shas, had been informed. So had Edelstein. But despite the fact that they knew Israel was about to attack Iran, the Haredi parties insisted on threatening to bring down the government. Now, in a last minute, and I mean last minute agreement, the Haredi parties came up with a compromise with Edelstein, which basically would have cut some of the sanctions and weakened the bill. It was still strong enough for Edelstein's purposes, but it was much weaker than he wanted. And they came up with this compromise, and the Haredim drop their support for the bill to dissolve the Knesset. And the next day, Israel attacks Iran. Now, how did we find out that Israel attacked Iran? Because at 3 a.m., the sirens went off, not because there was incoming missiles, but because we had attacked the Iranians, and we knew, or the government knew, that the Iranians would hit back. So at about 3 a.m. on a Friday morning, we were all woken up by the air raid sirens, ran into our shelters, and got messages on our phone. Israeli forces are currently bombing the heck out of Iran. And the enlistment issue was basically forgotten for a while. We were more focused on the fact that, unlike Hezbollah and Hamas, the Iranian missiles were getting through our defenses, buildings were being destroyed, and people were being killed. But as soon as that ended, the fight over enlistment began again, and in earnest. And the Haredim began demanding, show us the bill. We want to go forward with this. And Edelstein met with politicians from the Haredi parties, and he presented them a copy of his bill. A bill, by the way, which no one had seen. They had seen the initial version, but his revisions, aside from the Haredim, nobody had seen it. I spoke to multiple members of his committee, both from the coalition and opposition, who all said they had no clue what was in the bill. His own people didn't know, only the Haredim and Edelstein. Now, the bill he showed them, apparently, he had gone back on his word, and the bill contained harsh sanctions. At the time, I spoke to one coalition insider who was familiar with the discussions and had seen the bill, and basically, he wouldn't detail everything that was in it, but he basically said, Edelstein went back on his word. This source said Edelstein was right, in terms of the ethics of the situation, which again, I'm not endorsing or going against. I'm a journalist. It's not my job to say who's right or wrong. But he definitely went back on his word. The Haredim were pissed. Haredim were really pissed. And last month, the Haredim pulled out of the government. United Torah Judaism pulled out of the coalition and the government, while Shas pulled out of the government, giving up its ministries, but stayed a part of the coalition. After Shas left, the one-man faction Noam quit as well. Noam is a far-right, homophobic, anti-LGBT Jewish supremacist party. They pulled out as well with their one seat, leaving Netanyahu with 60 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. He no longer had a majority. He's now running a minority government, but he is still in power. He just is going to have trouble passing legislation. So the Haredim pull out, and you start getting calls within Netanyahu's Likud party to get rid of Edelstein. Edelstein screwed us. Edelstein drove the Haredim away. This is unacceptable. So the Likud held an internal faction vote in the Knesset and decided we're going to get rid of Edelstein. We're going to replace him with Boaz Bismuth, a Likud member of the committee, who they felt could potentially pass a bill acceptable to the Haredim. Now, honestly, it doesn't seem that there's any bill that would be acceptable to a majority of non-Haredi lawmakers and the Haredim as well. And any bill which would be satisfactory to the Haredim would be pretty much automatically struck down by the High Court. But there was this feeling, if someone could do it, it's Boaz. So last week, the Knesset, in back-to-back votes in the Knesset House Committee and Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, ratified the Likud decision and appointed Boaz Bismuth to be in charge. Right before the vote, Edelstein actually released a copy of his bill, which was, in the words of the Haredim, draconian, but satisfied the desires and the demands of most Israelis. It would have put restrictions on Haredim who didn't go to the army, ranging from bans on international travel to withdrawal of driver's licenses to basically cuts in almost all government benefits except like the most basic things like healthcare, which they're not going to cut no matter what. That's like a basic thing. But anything extra, too bad, you're not getting it. And so now, the Haredim, you would have think the Haredim would be happy, they'd be satisfied, but they're not, because something else happened in the meantime, which is one, the sending of tens of thousands more draft notices. This is a problem for the Haredim because once a candidate for military service ignores enough draft notices, they are declared an invader, a draft dodger, and they can be arrested. They are banned from leaving the country. That's something that was in Edelstein's bill that already existed. And this would essentially criminalize the entire Haredi population between the ages of like 18 and 26. None of them would be able to leave the country. They would be subject to arrest. And basically most yeshiva budgets would be cut totally because you can't send a budget to yeshiva for students who are draft dodgers. It would also affect their daycare subsidies as well. So it's a major problem from the Haredi point of view. At the same time, the IDF has announced that it is starting a new enforcement campaign against the Haredim, where it will begin, it's admitted it doesn't have enough jail cells for everyone, but they've already started arresting draft dodgers, prompting the Haredim to accuse the government of declaring war against the Olam HaTorah, the Torah world, and to declare their own war against the government. The Haredi parties and major rabbis are now discussing how they're going to do this, what their approach is going to be. But this morning, pretty much every Haredi newspaper in the country ran page one banner headlines saying we're at war. So things are going to get very interesting. We're probably going to see massive street protests every time Haredim are arrested. In fact, Haredim are currently blocking Route 4, one of the major Israeli coastal highway, in both directions, stopping traffic. A video from the scene that I saw right before I went on this Zoom showed police dragging young Haredi men off the highway. Unsuccessfully, they keep running back, while the Haredim scream Nazi, Nazi back at the police. So this is sort of the situation we're finding ourselves in right now at this moment, at least with the Haredim. The basic situation now legislatively is Bismuth, the new head of the Vadat Chutz U'Biטachon, has reportedly said that he wants to try to have a new version of a bill ready by the end of the Knesset recess in October for passage through its final two readings necessary to become law. In fact, even though the Knesset is on recess currently, the committee is still meeting regularly and is scheduled to hold its first discussion under Bismuth on this issue next Tuesday. So we're going to have to see what happens there. Uh, at the same time as this is happening, and this is something I mentioned earlier, the government is currently trying to fire the Attorney General, who has been one of the biggest advocates for sanctions on the Haredim, and is one of the people behind pressuring the army to up its enforcement and pushing the government to send these orders. The coalition has been very angry at the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara, for the past couple of years. It's accused her of basically trying to stop its legislative agenda because often the government will come up with, a bill or a proposal, and the Attorney General, who has an oversight role here in giving her legal opinion on government decisions and legislation, has said this is illegal or this contravenes the law, really upsetting the government. So the government tried to fire her uh, and was unable to do so. Under the existing regulations, they had to convene the same committee that appointed her in the first place, which requires the participation of a former justice minister. None of the living former justice ministers have agreed to serve on the committee, forcing the government to change the rules of the game in the middle and create a new ministerial panel to fire her. This panel indeed fired her, although the High Court of Justice said that this is problematic, froze the firing, which multiple ministers have said that they're going to ignore. And now the government and the Attorney General will be heading to court in the coming days to determine whether her termination was even legal. This is part of that larger, as I said, move connected to the judicial overhaul, trying to get rid of the so-called gatekeepers in Israeli politics. This is also connected to the Haredi issue because the Haredim were among some of the biggest boosters of the idea of a judicial overhaul because they knew that any bill exempting them from military service would be struck down by the courts, and therefore they wanted to limit and curb the power of the courts before the passage of such legislation. So that sort of leaves us where we are at the moment. Most Knesset legislation is frozen because we're in the middle of a recess, but we are right now on the verge of a major internal clash with Israel's ultra-Orthodox community. The Attorney General's future is up for grabs, and Israel's security cabinet will be determining tonight whether or not we launch a massive new offensive in Gaza, which could potentially lead to a long-term occupation of the Strip. So, anyone who thought things were going to calm down, things are just heating up again. What I think I'd like to do after this cheery half hour of nothing but good and happy news where everyone gets along is to actually sort of open things up for questions. I sort of find this is the most valuable part of these types of events is to do an extended long Q&A to give you the opportunity to ask about the issues that have been bothering you or things that you want to know about. So does anybody have anything they want to ask about or a topic related to this that I haven't mentioned? Yes, Ted Greenwood.
Let me just allow him to unmute because right now he is not able to unmute himself. Okay. Ted.
So thank you, Sam. That was really wonderful. Um, I wonder whether you could comment on the various opposition parties' views on these things you have been talking about. You've talked about the government, the Haredim, but you haven't really talked about the other side. And there's a variety of parties there, and I wonder whether you could unpack that for us.
So, the opposition parties have been pretty united in their opposition to many of the policies being promoted by the Netanyahu government. And that's been remarkable given that the opposition currently sort of runs the gamut from the old left. And the Israeli left is not what it used to be. It's a much smaller force. People here still talk about the dichotomy between left and right, but that doesn't really exist anymore. In current Israeli politics, is generally speaking the right versus the center. But, you know, there's been a sort of consensus on certain issues, even though there's a lot of disagreement among the parties on the opposition, but the right-wing opposition parties, the centrist opposition parties, and the left-wing opposition parties have been united in their views on certain issues, chief among them the Haredim. Avigdor Lieberman's hawkish Yisrael Beitenu party, Yair Lapid's centrist Yesh Atid party, the Yair Golan's the Democrats party, which is a merger of the traditional Labor Party and the far left Meretz Party, have all basically agreed on the conscription issue. They've also been, issuing similar statements relating to the need to bring the hostages home, which has appeared to been, which they say has been less of a priority for the Netanyahu government. Uh, how they approach issues like the war itself has differed, but at this point, there's basically a consensus among the opposition parties that Netanyahu has mismanaged the war. If you speak to more right-wing uh, politicians, they might say, who are opposed to Netanyahu, they might say he wasn't aggressive enough, he didn't do enough to win early on. In the center and the left, they think we should make a deal, pull back to the periphery of Gaza, and do targeted raids. That's also something Yisrael Beitenu has said. Yisrael Beitenu has also said we should cut off all electricity and food to Gaza and just let the Egyptians deal with them. Uh, but the basic idea has been, that Netanyahu has mismanaged the war. That's what they all pretty much say. I think that there's been one issue which has dogged Israeli policy since day one of the war, which is Israel never really had a plan for civilian governance or for the day after. You've had a variety of approaches, everything from let's bring in the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Palestinian Authority to run things to let's annex land and establish settlements. And the problem has been that from the beginning, there was never any real plan. No one approach was adopted. So Israel would go into an area, eradicate Hamas, leave, Hamas would go back in. We really didn't have anything on the ground to replace it, creating a vacuum. And I think that's part of the reason the war has dragged on for so long. Uh, I'm not going to say what the right solution is. I will say, at the risk of venturing an opinion as a journalist, that we should have had some solution. We should have had some plan. Now the basic plan they're talking about is occupation. We'll see if that goes through and what happens. Uh, but because of political pressures, because of coalition pressures, Netanyahu never really had a definitive plan for the day after, and that's something that's been an issue for us from day one. I've even heard people in the coalition criticizing Netanyahu from the right, saying, you're not aggressive enough. I think Netanyahu has managed to upset a lot of people in terms of his handling of the war. Uh, whether that's justified or not, again, not my place to say. But that's about, the answer. I think the opposition is also, the challenge for the opposition is going to be the same challenge it had last time when they deposed Netanyahu in 2022, prior to Netanyahu's return. We had a broad-based national unity government featuring everything from hard left parties to religious Zionist pro-settlement parties to centrist parties to even an Islamist party, the Arab Ram Party, which is avowedly Islamist. And they had so many differences that they were unable to last more than a year, leading to Netanyahu coming back. And that's going to be the challenge if they manage to win the next elections, which are scheduled for late 2026, but could come earlier if the government falls. How does a coalition combining hard right, hard left, center right, center left, whose main point of commonality is disliking Netanyahu. How do they manage to run things? And that's going to be the main thing we're going to have to watch out for. Who else wanted to ask
So
questions?
I'm going to make a little list because I've been watching Jennifer
Yeah.
Goldsmith, then Kenneth Auerbach, and then Chanel's question in the chat. And then we'll move on to
All right.
Michaela and Andrew.
Hi there. First of all, just thank you for your time and for this incredibly thorough description. Sorry to be outdoors. So this has been such a thorough description of the view on the business of Israel and the sort of interactiveness among the factions in Israel. Can you guys hear
in
me?
and out a little.
Okay, you know what I'm going to suggest? Let's have another question from someone else and I'll go after because I'll have better sound in a moment. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, great.
Kenneth.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been extraordinarily helpful and informative. Two issues that you didn't touch on, but also are floating around, if you will.
Yeah.
Netanyahu's ongoing criminal trial, which seems to drag on like the Dickens Bleak House case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which, as a former lawyer, really is shocking to me because you don't have civil juries there. Why judge trials take so long? And the other is any evidence of accountability for what I think was Netanyahu's biggest failure was this whole notion that we could trust Hamas in the first place.
Okay, so let's start with your second point, which was, our view of Hamas. I think this was one of Israel's major failures, was that we got sort of stuck in a cycle of conflict with Hamas that we thought was manageable, meaning Hamas would attack, we would bomb them or launch a limited ground incursion, they would stop. Next year or two, we would go back, rinse and repeat. But the feeling was Hamas couldn't get through the fence and didn't have the desire or capability of doing so. And that was a major miscalculation. And because that was the operating assumption, intelligence, which indicated otherwise, was generally, sort of interpreted through a faulty lens. It wasn't that we didn't have intelligence about what would happen. It was that when your strategic conception is wrong, you can't accurately or properly analyze the information at your disposal. Now, Netanyahu had facilitated the transfer of Qatari cash into the Gaza Strip to help prop up Hamas for years. The feeling was basically, as long as they don't collapse and they can maintain their rule, they're not going, we can keep a certain, the conflict on a certain low boil. And, it's obviously the fault of the people who are policymakers, and not just Netanyahu. There were many people, including other previous governments. This has been going on for years, and there's enough blame to go around. But I'm not going to pretend that the rest of us in Israel, the average citizens or us in the media, thought differently. We all thought it was contained. We all thought that Hamas was not going to do this. We all thought that if something happens, it'll be in Lebanon or in the West Bank. But that's, it's important to note that, we had a very mistaken strategic conception here. Regarding Netanyahu's trial, Uh, there are advantages and disadvantages to the Israeli system. In the United States, you're not going to be trying a chief executive. You're not trying the president during his term of office. Uh, and in Israel, you are. Uh, Now, this has been problematic in how long it has dragged on for. And definitely, I think that it would have been better for the country if it had been resolved much more speedily, one way or the other. Uh, and, in any other country that was not in the middle of multiple wars against multiple enemies, I think it would be much bigger news. And it is big news here, the Netanyahu trial and the allegations that his top aides were accepting money from Qatar and the various things that are happening politically in terms of the scandals. But they sometimes get overshadowed by everything else happening. Uh, we have been involved in so many conflicts that it's gotten to the point that now when the Houthis in Yemen launch a missile, we respond to it in sort of a casual way, like, hey, another rocket attack. We don't even get excited anymore, very often. So, things that would be the most important issue in the world suddenly take on a little less importance when missiles are falling overhead. But personally, I think it would be good for the country if things did not drag on as long as they have. Having a trial take years and years and years is not good. There's not much more I can say about that.
Jennifer, do you want to try again?
Let's try again. How's this? Can you hear me all
Oh,
right?
much better.
Good.
Yeah, you're coming through great.
So I was thinking about this. I mean, you gave us such a thorough description of the sort of interior life of Israel. And it feels like it rhymes with the chaotic interior life of the US in so many ways. Are we wed to sort of promises that were made at the time the Constitution was written? How, the infighting, when you hear about it in another country, it's like, oh, we're not so unique. But we also live in this global ecosystem. And what I'm curious about, because we're really steeped and saturated in the response to what's happening on the ground in Gaza, in this country. And I would say the level of attentiveness to the specifics of intra-Israeli politics is not where focus is. And I'm wondering if you can sort of speak about how in Israel, whether there's a collective voice or different voices, are responding to this sort of global attentiveness to what feels like a crisis in Gaza. And I will say, and there's a lot written and said about this, about empathy for Israel, pivoting to empathy for people on the ground in Gaza. And that feels very complex as an American Jew in this moment because there's so much media focus on it. So really my question is about how the external perception is refracting internally in Israel.
All right, so there's definitely concern in Israel about how we are perceived abroad. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett just posted this week a lengthy post on on Twitter, basically blaming Netanyahu for how badly we're viewed abroad, saying, we've lost Democratic support and we're going to lose Republican support. And I think many Israelis are very concerned about how we are perceived. That being said, I think a large number of Israelis do think that we're doing a lot to try to take care of the Palestinians in terms of their humanitarian situation. I think 78% of Jewish Israelis, according to a recent poll, said that given the circumstances of the fighting in Gaza, Israel is making efforts to avoid causing suffering to the Palestinian population. And obviously there is hunger in Gaza. There are humanitarian problems. I think part of the problem, though, is, given the fact that Israel is not allowing the foreign press into the Gaza Strip, the only way to get into Gaza is on an IDF tour. You can't just go in and go around. So there's no independent outside press reporting from within Gaza. And that makes it harder to determine, one, the scope of what is happening. Is it as bad as the worst detractors say? How much of the blame is Israeli? How much is because of aid convoys being hijacked? And a lot of them are. It makes it very hard. It's sort of like you're looking into a black box and you're trying to say what's happening. So I am not going to deny that there is suffering in Gaza in no way, shape, or form. And I'm not going to deny that there appears to be hunger in Gaza. What I will say is I find it hard personally to make any pronouncements as to what exactly is happening because we don't have the access as journalists that we want. And that's a major problem. What I can say is that the statements by some members of Netanyahu's cabinet have made Israel's job in explaining how it's running things in Gaza and how it's operating in Gaza much harder. When you have ministers talking about nuking Gaza or, let's cleanse Gaza, saying things like that, it generates a lot of anger abroad and a lot of anger internally in Israel as well. So this is something that Bennett was saying on Twitter the other day, was when you have Israeli ministers whose statements have been repudiated by Netanyahu saying these things, it really does make us look bad. But again, without being able to go on the ground in Gaza and really see things ourselves, it's very hard to feel like we're able to describe things with any accuracy. But at least I don't feel comfortable. That's an unsatisfactory answer. Things are sort of lost in the fog of war. Who's at fault? How bad is it? But, sometimes the answers are just not satisfactory.
We have Chanel Klein. How do Israelis feel about Netanyahu's decision to go into Gaza and occupy it? What about the hostages? I read in the Times of Israel that Hamas might kill all of them with that strategy.
So the defense establishment has been arguing against the strategy being pushed by Netanyahu and his political allies. They've said something similar. It'll endanger the hostages. And at the same time, many Israelis want to see some sort of deal which would end the fighting and allow Israel to get the hostages back and to pull out. Hamas has not agreed to such a deal yet. I don't know what's going to happen in that regard, but many Israelis are very, very angry about the continuation of the war. Again, not my place to say who's right, who's wrong, what we should do, but many people here are very, very critical of Netanyahu. I remember speaking to one hard right lawmaker in the Knesset who was angry at Netanyahu, basically saying, why should we continue to send reservists in to get killed if we're not going to just give a knockout blow? On the other hand, you have people in the center and on the left saying, cut our losses, we've done what we can, go back to the occupy the border of Gaza, have a buffer zone and do what we do in the West Bank, which is send in targeted raids against terrorists. So, there's a variety of, critiques against Netanyahu, but I think war weariness in Israel is a real thing.
Michaela, you were next.
Hi, thank you very much for connecting the Israeli to connecting the Haredi draft issue to the judicial reform issue. I wasn't aware of that. I started sitting on my suitcases. I lived 31 years in Jerusalem with the so-called judicial reform. I would like to respond to Jennifer Goldsmith's comment about the mirror effect with what's going on in the United States. My personal understanding of the judicial reform is that it was partially fomented, I guess you could say, or created by wealthy American Jews, the Kohelet Forum, etc. And I don't think it's, I mean, when we try and look at history in the long view, I think that general globally, we're having some, we're going through some kind of contractions and expansions and some kind of different understanding about, which government that we really want. What kind of government do we want? Democracy is unwieldy. And as we see in Israel, we have these coalition politics that are so fragile, where a tiny minority can just dump everybody off the tracks and ruin everything for everybody, or just affect things in a disproportionate way, radically disproportionate. I'm sorry to ramble, but my question is this. October 7th was partly a failure of listening to the intelligence on the ground. I understand, and this was reported in the 2 Sundays ago in the New York Times Magazine. Even phone calls, and we've heard other media report on what was going on in Shabak and what was going on with the Pitaniot, and how they were just being categorically ignored. And now we're seeing a suggestion of, let's go and reoccupy the whole thing. Where are the senior military and ex-military that you're talking to? Where are they with the coalition? Because in my understanding, they're sacred cows. I mean, they have right, left, center, whatever. They have the experience. And what are they saying? Are they saying different things? Because I did see something, it was kind of a dramatization of a war room conversation. And Danny Yatom was there, and there's sort of other, maybe it was AI, I don't know. It was something that passed on my media feed about, and all of these old military guys were saying, no way, we cannot do that. That's a bad idea. So what have you heard on that count from the military? Where are they regarding what the coalition is doing or not doing right now about the war?
Look, I mean, the military has been pretty clear that they think that this is not the best strategy. The IDF chief of staff has said this repeatedly to Netanyahu, that he would prefer a more restrained, slower strategy. At the end of the day, the military leadership answers to the political echelon, and I think everything comes down to this evening's, I think they sat down to start speaking at 6. I don't know, I've been on the Zoom now. I haven't heard or been following, so I don't know what came out of it, but it looks like, it looks like we're probably going to have, a decision to go ahead with this operation. At the same time, Netanyahu spoke today. He sent a statement to, here I'm actually pulling up the Times of Israel now as we speak, because Netanyahu, here we go. I'm pulling up something that he said, one moment. He told an Indian outlet that Israel will not annex Gaza, and that he eventually plans to transfer control to an unspecified transitional governing body. So it's unclear, if there's a reoccupation, how long that'll be, and, how much of the strip will go to some transitional administration, and how much we'll keep ourselves. A large number of Likud ministers and Knesset members, I think 22, sent a joint letter to Netanyahu the other day demanding that he allow one of the settlement organizations on the West Bank to tour northern Gaza to find sites for new settlements. I don't believe Netanyahu has approved it, but there's internal pressure within the coalition and within the government to sort of rebuild the settlements that were dismantled in 2005 during the disengagement. In fact, this summer, the government approved resettling 2 settlements in northern Samaria, which were dismantled during the disengagement. If you recall, during the disengagement wasn't just Gaza, but the Hitnatkut was also 2 Yeshuvim in Tzfon HaShamron. So these 2 Yeshuvim, Sanur and Chomesh, I believe, are going to be resettled. Actually, this morning, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich did a photo op in Sanur, which caused a bit of a flap in Israel because the photo initially sent of Smotrich by the Samaria Regional Council showed him next to a destroyed building in the settlement, and there was graffiti right next to him saying "Death to the Arabs," and he's standing there smiling next to graffiti that says "Death to the Arabs." So he had to put out a statement basically going, "We didn't notice the graffiti. I don't support killing Arabs." So that caused a bit of outrage this morning.
I mean, the failure of the Hasbara is not going to change if this stuff keeps going on. I mean, Bibi knows that.
I think that there's been a lot of stuff that's come out of government ministers. Look, you have to understand that this isn't like in the US where where the president will appoint cabinet members and he can fire them at will. Technically, Netanyahu can, but his cabinet ministers, you need to keep your coalition together. And who's in the cabinet? Guys from your own party, but also the heads of the parties in your coalition. So, Netanyahu can't really sack a lot of these people, even when they break coalition discipline, say stuff that goes against his policies. When Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, goes up on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, and runs a prayer service, which is against Netanyahu's policy, Netanyahu can say the status quo hasn't changed, but Ben-Gvir is changing the status quo. Netanyahu does not have the same level of executive power as, Trump does in the States. Next question.
I just want to say that we're at 12:33. Sam, if you want to stay on and keep answering questions, you are
I
able
could
to.
answer a couple more.
Okay.
Let's
Just
see.
want to respect everyone's time. Em, do you want to?
Yes, it's just a quick question. I keep hearing different things about what the Israeli news talks about Gaza. And like citizens in Israel hearing the same thing that we're hearing, what is going on there?
Look, I mean, we have in the Hebrew press, there is discussion of the humanitarian situation. There is a discussion of what's happening on the ground in Gaza. But, as I follow the domestic news here much more than I follow the international news abroad nowadays. But as far as I'm aware, most of the focus abroad is on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And in Israel, it's less because we're also dealing with the plight of the reservists, with the fight over Haredi enlistment. There's so many other issues related to the conflict here that it doesn't get the same amount of attention that it does abroad. But that's, I think sort of a natural function of, being here domestically. Whether or not it's enough coverage or not, that's not really for me to say, mostly because for good or ill, most of my focus when I'm reading domestic news coverage here is on the politics rather than on the military and humanitarian side. I follow that as a regular news consumer rather than as a journalist. It's the stuff that I'm really going deep inside baseball on is the political stuff. But yeah, Israelis are very well aware of what's happening in Gaza, and Israelis care.
I understand it's a complex issue for us here in Israel, much more than here.
Oh, very, very much so. And one common refrain that I've heard many times in the Knesset, and I've said many, many times, is I miss boring. I miss, times when, something now which we would considering, shtuyot, just, can't think of the English word for shtuyot. Does everyone know what shtuyot is? Like
Believe-
nourishkeit, basically.
Nonsense.
Nonsense, thank you. You know, something that we would now consider shtuyot would be the big you know, scandal of the day. Like back when you know, when Yitzhak Rabin had to resign at one point because his wife had a foreign bank account, which was illegal at the time. You know, something that nowadays we would look at and go, who cares? You know, I wish we could go back to that situation where something that small was the scandal of the day. But we are in a never-ending busy news cycle, which is good for me, I guess, because it means I always have a job.
Peter Friedland, did you have a question? I'm sorry if I skipped you. Can ask you to.
I'm sorry. The question I was going to ask was twofold. And the first part was what M had actually just raised. And then as a follow-up to that, I was wondering if you could speak to the issue of rising anti-Semitism in the world once the world is going to be allowed to go into Gaza and actually see the devastation that has happened there, however you want to label that devastation. My terror is that it will be with the kind of shock that people had when they went into the Holocaust concentration camps.
I am very much opposed to any comparisons between what's happening in Gaza and the Holocaust. But as to your point regarding anti-Semitism, we see and have seen every time there is a major Israeli conflict, an uptick in anti-Semitism abroad. That has been a recurrent pattern. What is worrying at the moment is because of the length and intensity of what's been happening, we've seen anti-Semitic attitudes, you know, legitimized across the political spectrum and in the mainstream in a way that we haven't seen before in previous rounds of fighting in 2009, 2014, etc. So, you know, this is incredibly concerning, incredibly worrying. And I'll say one thing that's nice about being in Israel, even though you know, we have missiles raining down on our heads, is the fact that we don't have to worry about anti-Semitism per se. You know, we have to worry about anti-Semitism in the sense of people are trying to kill us, but you can walk down the street as a Jew and feel comfortable. So that's always something that I found comforting. That being said, the missiles are not exactly anything to laugh about. You know, a while back, a Houthi missile that had been intercepted by Israel and blown up. Well, you know, when you blow up a missile traveling at thousands of miles an hour, high, you know, thousands of feet in the air, it doesn't just stop. You know, it keeps going in pieces, but it keeps going. And a chunk of missile the size of a refrigerator actually crashed into the street a few blocks from my home one evening. It was I actually did not hear it from my apartment, but I looked on a local WhatsApp group and it said that a missile had fallen. So I grabbed a camera and a notebook, ran down the street to take a photo. My teenage son grabbed his smartphone and started running behind me, yelling, "I want to get a selfie with the missile," uh, and would not listen when I told him to get the hell back in the house. I actually got there. The site was surrounded in the middle of the night, by the way, by a crowd of people gawking, including, you know, couples with strollers and small children. And my son was actually there taking selfies with his iPhone with the missile. But you know, in a way, I would rather deal with that than having to worry about anti-Semitism. I remember I was in the States in 2019 and I was walking with a friend in the village and someone sea-kyled me. Uh, you know, it's not pleasant. So
Right. I wasn't trying to compare what
no,
was
I,
going
I
on in
obviously you
Gaza
weren't. I
to the
understand.
Holocaust. What I was addressing was the issue of the shock and disturbance that I think the world will experience one day when, in fact, foreign newspapers are able to truly get into Gaza and expose some of the devastation. So again, I don't compare it to the Holocaust. I'm speaking to the devastation.
What I'll say is a lot of the devastation, as I said, there's some things that are still unclear, but a lot of the devastation is there for the world to see. The photos of destroyed neighborhoods, parts of Gaza, there's like almost no buildings left. But I don't think we have to wait for that point to see the uptick in anti-Semitism. It's already here. It's on the right, it's on the left. The one thing that's always, again, to venture an opinion when I normally wouldn't, because as a reporter, the one thing that bothers me is when each side, will call out the other side. The right will call out the left for anti-Semitism, the left calls out the right, but might ignore it in their own ranks. And the problem is anti-Semitism has, metastasized and is appearing across the spectrum now, and it's becoming a real issue. And it's something to be concerned about. I don't really know what else I could add to that, intelligently at the moment. Sure, all of you see it day to day more than, I do from here. I used to cover anti-Semitism professionally when I was at the Jerusalem Post. I covered diaspora Judaism, but, I'm not sure I can really add anything to your own lived experience.
Thank you for a very enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. I guess I'll take one more question.
I would love to. Mike Sandman wrote in the chats. I'm sorry, Jennifer, I see your hand. But the fog of war has not prevented the UK, Frame, and Canada from threatening to recognize a Palestinian state. What's the impact on debate in Israel about the government's actions in Gaza?
Well, what I can say is that all of this has prompted the opposition to basically say, Netanyahu, you're running things so badly that you're causing this, which is a diplomatic disaster for us. And there a lot of people are blaming Bibi for it. And, again, not my place to say who's at fault, but it's definitely something that's being said, and that's definitely a large part of the discourse right now.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much for being with us. I know that there's many people who are singing your praises, and this was really wonderful. We'll be sending the recording to those who missed it and who might want to catch up on some re-watch some things. But thank you everyone for being here today.
And thank you for having me.